Hey everybody, this is Pastor Roger Cook. I am the pastor of Red Door Ministries. We are a faith-based club on Radford University campus that is LGBTQ welcoming and affirming, sponsored by Grace Episcopal Church, Radford, Virginia. I'm also the emerging church pastor of your church, MCC, an emerging Metropolitan Community Church here in the New River Valley. And tonight's discussion is with Lutheran pastor Emmy Kegler. You can follow her on social media, and she's the author of One Coin Found. Tonight's discussion was just amazing. Honestly, it was one of my favorite discussions, and just had a great time. Hope you enjoy it. I am with Charlie and Luca, and we are making some dinner, but we'll hope you watch the discussion and enjoy it. Thank you. You want to have pizza? Thank you guys. Bye-bye.
I want to thank everybody being with us today. I have Pastor Emmy Kegler, and be honest, we've been talking for a moment and probably going to fanboy out. I am a huge fan of her work, of her social media presence, of her book, One Coin Found, that I personally read, that we discussed, we've been over the messages with at our emerging church plant in the club at Red Door. And I have been so excited for this conversation today. Amy, thank you so much for being with us.
So grateful to have the invitation, Pastor Roger, and so glad to be with you all. And this is that weird time, right, when everything is upside down and topsy-turvy, but I'm so grateful that we're developing and strengthening the digital ways that we have to connect. I don't know if I would have been able to be present to you in person, but now I have the chance to be present to you all digitally, and I'm really grateful for that. So thank you for inviting me.
Your time is so valuable, and you got a lot going on, so thank you so much for this. And this is a totally different side note to everything, is this past weekend for National Coming Out Day, I loved your video you made. That was totally awesome. And if anybody has not seen that, go back and try to find that. That was just great. And I really like in the video, how it took a turn at the end, but a turn that needs to be said. And we may get to that as we talk later on about the book. But with One Coin Found, would you mind taking a moment and just kind of breaking down for those who may watch this later that don't necessarily know what it's about?
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like this. I've learned now to always have a copy at hand. The first time somebody asked me to be on a Zoom call and then they mentioned the book, I went, oh shoot, copies, I don't know, somewhere buried in my desk. One Coin Found is, what I wanted to call it is a hermeneutical memoir. And so what those words mean for me is that it's a story of my life in the sense of it being a memoir. And it's also how my life has affected how I read scripture and how scripture has affected how I read my life. And I proposed that title to my editor, Lisa. I said, that sort of theme. I said, I want to call it a hermeneutical memoir. That's how I want to summarize it. And she said, oh, no, that's don't ever say that to anyone. No one is going to read a hermeneutical memoir. And I went, okay, fine. But that is what the book is trying to do, is trace really the first sort of from age 4-ish to about age 30 years of my life, and talk about what was my exposure to Christianity and organized Christian religion. How did that interact with my understanding of myself and the world around me? And how did those two continue to inform each other as they went through the process of me coming to understand that I'm gay, and then coming to understand that I'm also called to ministry and what that's meant for me.
And several things in the book resonated with me personally, having an evangelical background, and looking at your ministry now and things that you're doing and accomplishing now. It was exciting for me to read and see how you went from that evangelical path. And I've been reading some Richard Rohr and some other people, and I kind of agree, and we'll get your thoughts on this, and this is maybe aside from the book, is do you think sometimes it's important, because I think Richard that was talking about, that sometimes we need sometimes we need that formal conservative evangelical framework at times to kind of to lead us in appreciation of a more progressive path?
Yeah, I think that's very true of what happened in my life, which is I was raised in the Episcopal Church and felt, very, very comfortable and very protected in the congregations in which I grew up. My youth group, I don't know that we ever talked specifically about sex or sexuality, but I was made to feel comfortable by the youth group leaders who knew by the time I was about 16 or 17 that I was gay. And at the same time, I felt like the congregation that I was in and the Episcopal Church as a whole was a bit, I think probably as a teenager I would have called it boring. Now I could say maybe stuffy or stoic or a bit too practiced. And I've come to appreciate that in different ways that I'll get back to. And what then led me to sort of depart from the Episcopal Church and end up in the Assembly of God and then in a non-denominational church was this desire for, like, I want something that's more emotional and that has these big emotional highs and that draws people in and really gives us this compelling message. And what happened was I found that and then discovered there's all of this beautiful stage production and the music has evolved. It's band led. You got a drum set and an electric guitar and an electric keyboard and the PowerPoint that's running the words on the screen. And like in 1999, like that was a big, like, whoa, what is this? What is PowerPoint? And what I discovered is so much of the aesthetics of church in the Assembly of God and in the non-denominational church that I attended had progressed, but the theology was still very much stuck in the 1950s or before. And I had to figure out how to deal with that. And I did come back with a lot of appreciation for a more liturgical church. And some of that being that that's within the liturgical churches, so within the Episcopal Church in which I was raised and in the Lutheran denomination that I now serve, some of that is that they've been informed by more progressive theologies and gotten to a place of accepting women as valid Christian leaders and queer people as called to ministry, just as we are. But another part of that is that I've come to appreciate when things have been really worked over and planned out for worship, when things are less spontaneous, the ability to critique them. So one of the things that I didn't like is that the Episcopal Church, you have a call and response that's written out right in front of you. It's in the hymnal or in the bulletin. You do this for Lutheran churches too. And a lot of mainline Protestants have this, that like, this is what we call in the business a rubric for how we structure worship. And, I'm going to the Assembly of God in the non-denominational church and finding like, oh, people are just shouting whenever they want and like saying amen. At one point we were a church that spoke in tongues and I was like, this is so cool and the Spirit is moving. And then I discovered you couldn't quite pin down exactly what right behavior was and what right responses were. And if you weren't having an emotional response to worship, if you'd come in and you'd just gotten bad news, if for whatever reason you just weren't quote unquote moved that night, you'd have to fake it. Because otherwise people would notice that you were not, emotionally participating. And I started to recognize the value in having something scripted out so that even on a day when I don't feel like I can do it, someone else has done it for me, right? Someone else has written out words for me. And if I have questions about what happens in worship, I don't have to try to remember, okay, in the midst of that 45 minutes to an hour and a half of worship content that I just experienced, something happened and I have to try to nail it down and remember what happened and ask questions about it. For liturgical practice, it's all there. And so then I can go and say, hey, we read this creed. What does that mean? Rather than like, can you go back to slide 100 and I don't know, and try to pin someone down and find that. So I've become appreciative of that in the sense that a planned liturgy can hold critique in a way that sometimes non-denominational flow does not. And I'm not saying one is necessarily better than the other. I'm saying this is where I've come to find treasures and still that capacity for pushback and critique.
I got to say, you've answered so many questions right there so beautifully and easily that I have stuttered and stumbled by for like 3 years. Our club is, we're faith-based. We have a lot of people from a lot of different faith backgrounds or no faith background. I love skeptics. I love spending time with people who don't have a lot of spiritual baggage. And but we get a lot of people from, there's a couple students I'm thinking of in particular that, and also even people from the emerging church plant that are from more of a contemporary, non-denominational background, and they don't understand why liturgy, and that's perfect. But when you say you've got to fake it till you, they remind you fake it till you make it. That is a non-denominational service. You can't come in with a downcast face, because that means there's a sin in your life or something wrong. There's just something that had happened. That was awesome. I'm gonna go. I'll go back. I'll tweet the heck out of this when we're
Please
done.
do. No, that was because one of the things that we've been forming I've been serving at Grace Lutheran Church, my current call, for 4.5 years. Yeah, 4.5 years this month. And about 3.5 years ago, we formed and launched what came to be known as the Queer Grace Community. And it's specifically an outreach ministry that is led by and created for and centered on LGBTQIA people in the Twin Cities who are looking for Christian community and who need that to, in some ways, center LGBTQIA experiences. Because in the Twin Cities, we have a lot of what are known as affirming churches that have gone through different processes of understanding their theology and their interpretation of scripture and gotten to a point where they say, like, children of gay couples will be absolutely accepted in our Sunday school. We will happily confirm a high school student with a name that is different from their baptized name because they've come to understand that they are trans or non-binary, and we're going to respect that, et cetera, et cetera. So what's interesting then is that we started having these conversations around, well, why are people still looking for Christian community when there are so many, little affirming communities? And some of it was, we feel so separated from each other because there's so many. And another part of it was, once a church has had the conversation around sexual orientation and gender identity, that can sometimes stop being a question that they wrestle with. And for so many LGBTQIA Christians in the Twin Cities, it's a question we're still dealing with, right? We are also the home to Bethlehem Baptist, which is where Desiring God and John Piper find their sort of physical home. And so what do we do with the fact that our city is still, although it's very progressive and the churches are progressive, still has tons of teens, youth, young adults, middle adults, boomers, etc., coming out of this sort of meat churning factory of evangelical thought and fundamentalist thought that says you can't be queer or trans and belong to the Christian church. So we ended up creating this community, and as we created Queer Grace Community, we were trying to figure out, what does the worship service look like? Because we were intending it for people who were leaving the evangelical church. And yet I really didn't want to get into the, like, okay, we do 30 minutes of music where, like, you start high, you kind of like crest the high wave, you get sad, you got to get the sad feelings down here. Then you have the sermon, which is 30 minutes to 45 on a theme. And then you have the altar call, and then the music that tips back up, right? And I was like, I don't like how manipulative that can get, right? Where especially when you have like one song after another, and the only thing you can do is participate musically or like get into a prayerful setting, and it has to follow this like arc or downward. What's a downward arc? So what we did was ended up blending a lot of parts of evangelical worship and mainline worship. And so we do have some parts that are scripted where we have clear responses. So for example, at the end, after we've shared in communion, we have what we call New Life, where we open up the mic and people can come forward and share something that's going on in their life. It's based on a prayer station that we did one time about Ezekiel in the Valley of Dry Bones, where we shook jars of beads, glass jars full of plastic beads, like for the rattling of the bones. And so the person gets to hold up a jar of beads and say, like, this is what's going on in my life right now. Here's how I'm seeing new life in me or in the world around me. And then they pour it into this larger jar. And so it's making this rattling noise as it falls. And they say, new life. And we all respond, new life. So what that's doing is recognizing, like giving space for people to recognize big or small milestones in their life in the context of worship. Sometimes it's a big emotional release. Sometimes it's just a simple joy, but it creates that liturgical sense as well, of like there's spontaneous sharing and then there's also a scripted answer, so that even if you did not come in interested in celebrating with other people how their life is experiencing resurrection, you still have this script for like, this is what we say, this is what they say, and then this is what we all say together. And I think that's provided a lot of grounding for those of us who have felt ungrounded in trying to find this middle way between mainline and evangelical.
That's awesome. My home church is a Metropolitan Community Church. We're in a rural area in Virginia that is growing. We have 2 universities. We have Radford University. We have Virginia Tech. A lot of people that haven't heard of Radford have heard of Virginia Tech. I don't follow sports, I'll be honest. But a lot of people know about Virginia Tech. But it is growing by leaps and bounds. And we have a growing, quickly growing upper class, very stable or small middle class, and a growing lower class poverty level. I hate to call it lower class, but and that being said, our Metropolitan Community Church, my home church, it is a beautiful mix of liturgical and contemporary, and I love that. And actually, my church is mainly. I was going to ask you a question, and in my mind, I'm answering my own part of it. But are you finding that a lot of millennials and the Gen Z are really drawn towards liturgy, which I know me being a church planter in the early 2000s, I was a proponent of exactly what you were saying. I was like in my mind going through it. I know that format of the up, the down, the manipulation, the altar call, and I've repented of that. But yeah, if I'm asking about the liturgy of the Gen Z, the church I'm a part of is largely boomers, and they love this mix of liturgy and the contemporary. And just what you said, there's an opportunity. It's like a not I want to say formality, but or scripted, but it is an order of service with room for spontaneity. It's beautiful. But what do you think about like Gen Z? Do you see the younger people being drawn to liturgy now?
I think Gen Z especially is drawn to liturgy when it's given purpose. If it's simply repeated, week to week, it just without explanation of like, why do we do this? Why is this called that? Why do we have this at this part of the service? Why did it suddenly change? These things that maybe we think within the main line, like everybody knows this. Everybody knows why why the paraments on the altar are green right now. Well, half of Gen Z right now, if I said paraments, they'd be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And the other half would be like, you've completely lost your mind. Like almost no one knows what a parament is. It's the colorful fabrics that you use to decorate a mainline church, like what hangs off the pulpit, what hangs off the altar, what hangs off maybe the side banners. And they're specifically paraments when they go along with church seasons. And church seasons are something that becomes inherent and informative and beautiful for people who are brought into them. And they can be so alienating and confusing for people who've never experienced them. Like all of a sudden you show up at church and it's like, boom, it's Lent and we're going to be sad now. And you're like, no, thank you. I would like to leave. And so one of the things that I've found is that worship is, what I try to do is design a worship service and a liturgy that is inherently pedagogical, that is teaching about what the different parts of the liturgy are and why we do it that way. So usually for Lent, I will explain in the bulletin or at the beginning of every Lenten service, like, this is why this time of the season looks different. It's the 7 weeks before Easter, and we observe these 40 days in the same way that 40 was this mystical, almost magical number for the people of Israel, and then for people who have followed Christian practices as well. This number 40 shows up for us in a lot of ways. And so we observe these 40 days of self-reflection, of intent, of increased prayer, of practicing more solemnity, or not sadness, but seriousness. And so I try to do that every time. Like, let's make sure we understand why we're doing this. And at the same time, also trying to adapt existing traditions with something that might be new and more enjoyable. So our Lenten liturgy, for example, is all bluegrass. And this is not new. Lots of churches have had a bluegrass liturgy, and I've heard lots of really good ones before, but ours is specifically, it is songs that exist in the secular world that we have now placed into worship. So for the call to gather and for our confession and forgiveness, we use Down to the River to Pray. For our communion hymn, which we sing together, we sing "Will the Circle Be Unbroken?" because we're gathering in a full circle, right, for communion. So we use pieces that people would experience in lots of different ways, right? Some people might know it from classic movies like "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" Some people might recognize, like, oh, this is music that my grandmother used to play on a cassette, like, oh, she loved Johnny Cash. Some people might recognize it as like, oh yeah, I'm in a mandolin band and we played these songs. Because of course that's something that people do now, is be in mandolin bands. And so I'm living constantly in this, like, okay, how do we keep the traditional parts that can still be informative and can teach us and disciple us and help us better understand the world around us and ourselves? And how can we keep drawing people into them? How can we not assume too much about the person that's coming in the door and what they might or might not know about the way that we worship?
That is great. And that is so much better than Easter Sunday where we did Crazy Train by Ozzy Osbourne just because we liked it. Thought it'd bring people in.
Every now and then, just because we liked it works. I did a Harry Potter Christmas pageant just because I liked Harry Potter, and that is the biggest turnout for worship we've ever had. It was great. It was delightful. It was 45 minutes. Normally our Christmas pageants are like 15, and my children's education superintendent came to me and was like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "No, you just trust me on this." And it was so great. It was so fun.
And that's one of the things about One Coin Found that I loved about the book is if you're listening to this discussion and we're using technical terms, using theological terms, and you're wondering, will I be able to follow this book? She also talks about Harry Potter a lot. It's several things in pop culture because, I mean, and I think it's a beautiful portrait, Emmy, of, you're a real person, and it's wonderful to see your story and to resonate with aspects of your story, and then see this journey. And I really think, like, for a lot of the students, it's just something that, I mean, and I told the students, I mean, I'd get them all a copy of the book because it's just, I mean, it's wonderful. It's just a wonderful portrait of someone's journey. And not a journey, but a journey that leads to a changed life, a life of discovery, and a life of purpose. And I mean, I think it's awesome. I'm trying not, like, I don't want to drag everything out of it because then they won't want to read it. But it's just it's awesome. Where we're at, we are, like I said, on the cusp of the Appalachians. I was with North American Mission Board and a missionary of the Appalachian People Group for a decade, and so we're right on the cusp of the Appalachian Mountains in near Roanoke, which is like our nearest city. But that being said, we have churches, some churches that are affirming. We have some churches that say they're affirming welcome. The mainline churches absolutely are. But for a large part, most of the churches in the areas are not. And there are churches that you can come and attend, but you can't serve. Now, not the main lines, but we start going into more non-denominational and other types of churches. And this might be redundant for where you're at, but you can maybe even talk to and address a question is, so here, if you hear that we are fully affirming and fully welcoming, they say, well, then you don't read scripture, or you don't talk about sin. And I know I'm not trying to put you in a place because we talk about that forever. But I think in your book, you point out that an adequate look at scripture, if anything, leads to a more affirming brown-skinned Savior than anything else would. But could you talk for a minute about the value of sin? But talk a little bit about how sin still does play into this faith that we're talking about that is all inclusive and all welcoming.
Yeah, I mean, that's the same kind of critique that gets leveled sometimes, I think, about in political dialogue. We say, like, oh, the liberals are the tolerant left, but they're intolerant of the right or whatever. Like they don't really practice what they preach. And it's this interesting thing of like, no, I talk about sin a lot, actually. I think I talk about sin more the more I have read scripture and the more I've come to understand my own sexual orientation and gender identity more clearly than I did before. And part of that is, the traditional recognition of what sin is, right? Where like I wound someone else for whatever reason. And some of that has like, so much of my work of understanding sin in that traditional sense has been informed by understanding like myself through therapy and through other, what we'd normally call secular means or worldly means of like, why did I do that? Or, oh my gosh, I did that. And I didn't realize I was hurting someone else at the time. And I did. And so for me, part of, a Christian understanding of sin has to be about self-examination, even when we're not intentionally hurting someone else, when we have still hurt someone else, whether it's something that we realize long-term, looking back on a relationship and going like, oh, wow, I was kind of manipulative in that. Or when someone comes to us and says like, hey, you said this thing or did that thing and hurt me. And you go, well, I didn't mean to. That's still taking part in a wounding of another person that we need to examine. And I don't think, in no way is the, whatever label you want to put on it, mainline or liberal or progressive or whatever, heretical, no, in no way is that, arm of the church somehow exempt from having hurt each other. And I think also what my understanding of myself as queer has opened me up to is that as an oppressed class in America and around the world, I have come to understand the way oppression works for other minority groups in a way that I'm not sure I would have tuned into quite as acutely if I had just been a cishet white chick from the suburbs. Like I grew up in a privileged family. I grew up like upper middle class. I grew up white and well off. I didn't get pulled over by a cop until I was maybe in my 19 or 20. Like I live in a very different world than a lot of people who share the same city as me live in. And so I don't know how I would have caught up to that in the same way if I hadn't also been made queer, because that opened me up to like, oh my gosh, not only are there ways that individual people hurt me, but there are systems in which people are encouraged or benefit from or just mindlessly without realizing it hurt me and perpetuate things that hurt me. And I can see it because I belong to this minority class. And now I can see how that's happening for other people. Obviously how it's happening for women because I experienced that as a woman, but also I can understand and appreciate like if there are systems that deliberately prioritize cisgender and heterosexual people and stigmatize being part of the LGBTQIA community, if I can understand that, why would I not also understand that there are systems that prioritize people of what we classify as white, which is a constantly changing target, and then people who we classify as people of color. And so for me, a huge part of my self-understanding and then my scriptural reading is just noticing over and over how God calls out oppression against the orphan, the widow, the stranger, right? Over and over again in the prophets. But you see it in the law too, in the first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, where God says over and over, we need to provide for those who are on the edges. It's not about let's exclude people who are already excluded, but rather let's continue to find ways to create systems where they are cared for. So like the early welfare system of farming, where farmers had to leave sheaves that fell as they farmed so that the poor, the orphan, and the widow could come and collect them, so that they would have a system of welfare to pick up and be able to eat when they did not have land or money for themselves. And we see this all throughout the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. We see it so often in Jesus's work. I mean, I always come back to when he's accusing the religious authorities of his day, and he says, you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and you forget the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and righteousness. And I'm like, oh, yeah, we spend a lot of time tithing our dill. Like, we spend a lot of time paying attention to like, what are the supposed actions that earn us, sort of points in the kingdom of heaven, versus what is Jesus actually asking us to do, which is completely step outside of a point system that ranks some people higher than others. And those systems are how we end up with things like sexism, racism, misogyny, queerphobia. I mean, the two are informative of each other. But yeah, I talk about sin a lot. My congregation probably wishes I didn't quite so much. Yeah, I'm sure they would appreciate if I backed down a little bit, because I do get on them a bit. Yeah, about sin. I do also talk about sometimes internalized sin. I was like, there's something else I wanted to say. That was it. I do also talk sometimes about the way we internalize sin and the way we absorb other people's actions and then do that same violence onto ourselves again, right? I'm talking about that a lot in the past 7 months with sort of the Protestant productivity work ethic, where we have this idea of like your worth is tied to how much you can make or how much you can work, right? We see this happening in American society, really around the world, but I like to pick on America for her sins because we're a mess. So, if you look at the way that we commodify basically everything, that if you have a hobby, it should be something that you can, post on Etsy and take cute pictures of and build your Instagram platform, that, whatever you're doing is meant to build your own personal brand or be able to monetize your worth in some way. And like, we completely lost the grip on, the very, very basic, like one of the first rules really in Hebrew Bible, which is that God rests on the seventh day, that every 7 days are supposed to be a day when you don't do work. Like, and so I call that out sometimes, of like, we've internalized this sin of a society that, being, free market capitalist says your worth is basically what's in your bank account or what you can buy. And we've internalized that and said this idea of rest is not that we ever condemn it, but just like, oh, we kind of make it sound like lazy, or we have to justify it, right? Like, here's my self-care day. Like, I've been working so hard, and so here's my self-care day. Like, yes, self-care is important, but also, like, it's not supposed to be a day. It's supposed to be mandated every 7 days. You get a day off. Like, we should be having a treat yourself every 7 days. And instead we have to like wait until it's International Treat Yourself Day to use the bath bomb that we've been like carefully hoarding until like, I don't know, has my day been bad enough yet? Is my mental health like deteriorated enough that I can throw this into the bath and for 5 minutes pretend that the world isn't falling apart? Yes. Today is the day. 1 week from now is the day. Like, we are supposed to be having regular rest. And we just threw that all out in order to feed the capitalist machine.
You've like, I had a list of things I was going to ask you about. You like this going through them like you're looking at my notes. Because I wanted to talk about self-care, because there's this in the world of COVID. It's one of the things as I check in with the students regularly, and they check in with me, and plus the people that we minister to in the community. It's huge. It's such a value. I wanted to talk about Empire. We'll go back to Empire. Was kind of wondering, would she be okay discussing this? Because I think you're okay discussing that.
Oh, yes. I texted a friend just recently and I said, I used to be so much more of a palatable gay, and I just, like, I've reached the end of my palatableness. Like, I'm grumpy and I'm old and I am going to complain about the world now, and I'm not going to play nice quite as much. So yeah, I'm happy talking about Empire, and I don't want to sound like I'm critiquing the culture of self-care in and of itself. What I'm critiquing is this sense that we have to have like a beautiful self-care that is Instagrammable and justifiable. And sometimes self-care is just like literally staying in your bed all day because you can't get out, and that is okay because it means tomorrow you can get out. But I feel like so often, like, self-care has to be like the bath bomb and the glass of wine and a candle and like a book that's about self-actualization in some way, right? Like, look, my self-care is reading How to Be an Anti-Racist. That is not self-care. That is community care, and it is important work. But like sitting down and digesting all of the racist internalized parts of ourselves that we have as white people, like, that's not going to feel caring. That is going to be work. And I feel like we've turned self-care into this concept that like it has to be justified and it has to be pretty. And And I think it would be much healthier if we can get to a point where self-care is a regular practice of small, ugly, and important things. So self-care can mean doing the dishes so that tomorrow I have a clean, like, set of pots. That is not like super cute. I guess you can throw like a speed track over it on TikTok and like make it kind of cool. But it's not really like doing the dishes every day is not sexy or Instagrammable. And yet it helps us. Going to bed at regular intervals, you know, like taking a nap in the middle of the day when we're exhausted. My friend Nora McInerney, who runs the podcast Terrible Thanks for Asking, and is just a delight, has been suggesting that like everybody should just be performing at about 40% of their capacity to produce right now. Like the world is too exhausting and we should be at 40%. I was like, Nora, that is not even a passing grade. Did you mean we should be doing 40% less? And she's like, no, I mean 40%, less than half. Like we are all worn out and we need to chill. And I was like, okay, you tell that to all the college students, because I don't think that the professors are going to shift their grading scale. But really, like where we can, what if we did less, but also we're able to start getting rhythms into our lives of doing something that cares for us long term, right? Like washing the dishes, like, you know, making our bed in the morning so that it's not a piled heap. Like what is it like to take those small actions that aren't really like sexy or Instagrammable, as I just keep playing on, but that make a difference for us and that we can do regularly every day, that become habits. Because the problem with like a spontaneous self-care or self-care when it's deserved or justified is that it only feeds us for so long. And if we don't get to a point where we have consistent self-care patterns that are feeding us repeatedly before we hit that wall of justification, we will hit that wall and it will be a much harder hit. So what if we can start developing patterns of like small self-care practices? Sometimes I'll just build that on the back of what other people need. So for example, I am much healthier, mental health, emotional, spiritual wise, if I cook for myself. I also don't cook for myself, but I have a wife. And my wife benefits when I cook for myself and her. And if I cook extras, then she has enough to take to work the next day. And I don't know if you know this, but most recipes you can make either 2 servings or 4 servings. So suddenly I have food for the next day. Now in my mind, I'm focused on like, I'm taking care of my wife, who I love and would do absolutely anything for. And if she asks me like, can you just bake a spaghetti squash for dinner? Like, absolutely, I will grow it myself out of my arm if I have to. Like, I will do anything for you. Versus for myself, I'd be like, yeah, but there's like a frozen meal in the back of the freezer that you would hate because it's all of the flavors that you don't like, but really you should eat that instead. And then like, why do I feel miserable through the rest of the evening? So sometimes I trick myself into self-care or, you know, restful restorative practices through like, what can I do for somebody else that's going to continue that motivation of what I've seen my friends call it mom mode, of like, you can't do it for yourself, but you can do it for a friend. You can't make the phone call that'll cancel the doctor's appointment because you hate the phone. That's me. I hate the phone, but you can do it for your friend. So mom mode, can I activate that for someone else and then happen to benefit myself at the same time? Those are some of the ways that I try to just like trick myself into more regular patterns of self-care.
When you even touched on one of the questions I was going to ask too about self-care is, do you believe that it reflects other relationships? And of course it does. You know, I think that, and what you just touched on is awesome, is, you know, caring for one another is sometimes easier than caring for someone else, and caring for yourself is easier than caring for just yourself. Thank you for that. A moment ago, we'll start talking about the Hebrew Bible. When I started my progressive journey, about 6 years ago now, I remember one of the most important things someone told me was, you know, go back and read the Old Testament, but, you know, read it as a marginalized person this time. And suddenly I wasn't able to say that I was the Hebrew slave. I found myself more in the role of the oppressor, and it just changed my whole view on Scripture, and changed my whole view on everything. And then we start even talking about eating the heads of wheat. We see Jesus and his disciples doing that very thing, and it plays so much. I just love Scripture. I think it's beautiful. I think enough of it. I look at it totally differently than I used to. I think you need to write a book on theology if you haven't. I think it'd be awesome.
My editor did solicit a second book, and so I'm actually working on something right now. And we joked about a theology, and I said, if I want to write a systematic theology, I think I want to have maybe 15 more years of experience under my belt first, so I can really get this all laid out, because I feel like there's still gaps in how I understand the way the world works. And usually what I feel in those gaps with is, I don't know, just trying to be less of a jerk to people. That's all I have. How does the Holy, what is the exact relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit? I don't know, and I don't care. Just be less of a jerk. That's not satisfactory for everybody. Some people really like to do the philosophy of religion, and what I talk about is sometimes systematic theology or higher theology, where it's very much about sort of the interpersonal life of God, and that has never been easy for me. And I've gotten to a point of just you know what? Someone else who's much smarter than me can do that. I will be here asking people to be less of a jerk. If the work that you do informs that, great, let's chat. And if not, that's fine. You do your thing, I'll do my thing. So.
I appreciate your answer and trust that answer. I'm always wary of someone who has all the answers, because the more education that I receive, the more I realize how little I know. And
Yep.
Go back. I'm going to go through my notes here. I was going through some things. You'd written in the book, and plus, for those that listen, she talks about love in the margins, and she shared a moment ago about being someone in the LGBTQIA community does give her insight into other marginalized communities. And when I came to this area, and my heart broke and fell in love with the area that I'm in now, my wife and I do the surveys, the assessments that I was trained to do to start a church, and was shocked to find out in such an affluent area who the marginalized were. And that was probably a couple of years into my coming out of the theological closet, and was just so shocked that in an area that I thought as progressive as where I'm at, that the LGBTQIA is still so marginalized here. It's heartbreaking. But that's an aside. Those that's listening here will know that what I'm talking about. But you talked about the American church proclaimed that faith was a self-alignment with the right doctrine, a confession that switched the eternal railroad track from hell to heaven, but made no alterations in the journey here on earth, except to spread the truth of the God who was not interested in the pains of this world, only the number of the souls that would make it to the next. And when you start talking about the American church, and then even when you're just talking about self-care, there's, I think, a disconnect from worrying about the numbers, worrying about the mechanics, worrying about the methods. And even when you was talking about liturgy, you made liturgy very emotional, very powerful, not mechanical. But I really think it was, look at the systems of oppression, the systems set up by empire, or in what I call civil Christianity versus the Christianity of the Christian Bible, I think sometimes when and just get your thoughts on this, when we make it mechanical, I think it's so much easier not to see someone as a person. I think it's easy. Father Shay Kearns with queertheology.com was said recently that it's so easy to argue the Kleiber passages because they're not making it personal. It's personal, but it's not a person. It's a concept. It's you're talking about, but it's not relationship. And just I'm finding more and more as we build relationships, it tears down this whole empire plan of here's this systematic setup of evangelicalism that if you do these things, you get these results. And I just kind of want to get your thought on what are some things that as Christians can we do in our lives and our faith to maybe start to see change happen. I want to eventually lead this to activism. A lot of my students are interested in activism, but what are some things that we can do in our faith to kind of make it less mechanical, make it more personal, and start, and what things that we can do to help see real change happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and you talked a little bit about liturgy and the mechanical, and one of the things that I've been attenuating to, paying more attention to in some of what the Queer Grace Community Ministry has done is we've ended up with a lot of folks who are disabled in some form, some of whom have developmental delays, some of whom are going through enough PTSD that it's a hindrance to sort of their participation in civil society in ways and forms, some that are physically disabled, obviously. And so one of the things that we've been interrogating a lot is this internalized sense I think in both conservative and liberal, if you want to try to define churches that way, which is always a mess. But one of the things is that we think that we can think our way to righteousness. And for a conservative, for what we might label a more conservative Christian, it's like, have you correctly assented to, the 5 fundamentals from the Presbyterian Church in 1910? Or, is it you've agreed with whatever your church's current statement of belief is about, the Bible's infallibility, blah, blah, blah. And for the liberal, progressive, whatever we label that side of church, it might be like, have we really thought through and carefully codified all of our liturgical words? Do we have this really well polished vocabulary? And then we suddenly come up the wall of like, hey, we've been basing our entire liturgy on the presumption that someone can read it. Turns out there's a lot of people in the world who are sight impaired. In fact, so sight impaired that a large print bulletin isn't going to cover it. Turns out there's a lot of people in America who don't speak English as a first language, who don't speak English well, even though it is their first or only language. And so when we use really complex vocabulary because we think we're trying to get at a really complex God or a really complex faith, we can isolate people. And so that's been a huge process of discernment of trying to better understand like liturgy as a living, breathing thing, right? That isn't, it can't be mechanical in the sense that we have to interrogate it and question it and say like, is this still conveying what we want to convey about God? Holy smokes, our liturgy was saying we're welcoming, but implicitly saying, if you can't read written words, you're not welcome. And some of that is just paying attention to the needs of the community, right? And just being intentional about the way that people react and respond. We can do that, for example, at Queer Grace Community because we're small. And so we know when someone comes in the door, I know exactly who they are and I know exactly how many times they've been there before. And that's the gift of a small congregation and a small ministry. And also the burden, right? Because then you have to like, then I also remember everyone's name, and then every now and then I'll have that moment of like, uh-oh, nope. And it's very obvious when you forget one name out of every other name you remembered. But one of the things that I think we get stuck sometimes in this, like, if we can think our way to righteousness, we'll act correctly. And this was a criticism that was leveled at the white American church, including, especially the progressive churches earlier this year when we had the shooting of George Floyd, which was at a church was near a church 2 blocks down that I served at in 2006. So I know that neighborhood. Like they said Cup Foods, and I know exactly where that is. I know exactly where the Diet Cokes are in there because I would go up there for lunch and get one. And what happened in a lot of churches in America that were trying to grapple with racism was we formed book groups. And we read How to Be an Anti-Racist, or we read Lane Duncan's Dear Church in the Lutheran Church, in particular, reflects on racism within the Lutheran Church. And we did these, or we read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, whatever. I think it's reflecting this idea that, like, if we think it through enough, we will get to right action. And I think the truth is, for a good majority of us, we're not ever going to think ourselves into perfect action. and we want to, right? We don't want to be wrong. We don't want to do something wrong. But at some point, we have to get out of the bookshop. So one of the things that happened right after George Floyd's shooting was the riots and protests in Minneapolis, in which South Minneapolis lost a couple of its key grocery stores. And North Minneapolis also saw fires, which was geographically very interesting because South Minneapolis and North Minneapolis are very far from each other. I mean, like you can get from one to the other, but like you have to drive on the highway. What happened in South Minneapolis was not, like it did not spill over in walking distance, but North Minneapolis is a predominantly Black community. We started seeing acts of arson there that we're still investigating, but that at least one has been tied to actions of outside white supremacists coming into Minnesota. And they lost a number of grocery stores and inexpensive resources like the Dollar General. Some places were burned and some places closed down out of fear. And so what I did was, and this was during COVID, right? I left my house for something other than getting groceries for the first time in 2.5 months to go over to North Minneapolis and start helping with a resource distribution. Basically, people were bringing in, like people were out in the suburbs buying diapers and toilet paper because you couldn't get them pretty much anywhere, but they were plentiful in the suburbs, and bringing them in. We were unloading the cars and then distributing them to the community as they came up. People didn't wear masks. I did not like that. I was like, you know what? There's a pandemic on. Like, I don't know if y'all know this, but like all the resource helpers were wearing masks, but a lot of people from the community were coming up not wearing masks. And I was like, I feel really upset and tense about this. If you all, if everybody was just thinking correctly, we would all know that we need to be wearing masks right now and we need to be keeping 6 feet apart. And these people who are coming for resources are not doing that. And I don't understand why. And I had to get to a point within myself of like, this is not about me. And this is not about what I think or might understand to be the right way to behave. This is about a community that is in dire need. And this is about a community that has been told so long, nationally, locally, systemically, personally, that they are not valued. So why would they value their lives enough to wear a mask or care? Why would they value their lives and be concerned about community spread when they are going to be responsible for childcare for 5 to 10 children as people are struggling with unemployment and dropping kids off with family to try to keep the kids fed? So a lot of my activism has been informed by understanding that I do not know the right answer, but other people are working on it and I can go where they are. I am definitely the type of person who likes to build stuff from the ground up because I do not trust that anybody else is as smart as I am. And this is a huge ego problem, right? And so I'm constantly trying to work on it of like, I am not the smartest person in the room. And it was very hard in the beginning of understanding myself as an activist or just like as somebody who is taking part in the way the world needed aid, to not say, okay, I need to form, like, clearly what I need to do is I need to be at the head of a new organization because I've been reading all these articles online about the pandemic or about resource distribution or whatever. Instead, to just show up and take part in what other people were doing and recognize that I was not necessarily the smartest person in the room. I did not know what that community needed. I did not need to make the calls about what that community needed. What I needed to do was put my hands to work where the work was needed. And I don't know that we will anytime soon in America. Oh, Pastor Roger has left the room and I am now the host. Well, this is fun. We'll see if he comes back in. But I know that as I am, oh great, you're back. Your mic's off, I think.
Yep.
There you are.
Sorry about that there.
That's fine. I was rambling anyway.
Oh, no, you was not. You was not. In the 10 years I've had this happen, and it still continues to record, which is great. It
just made me the host, and I was like, okay, well, I'll just talk to myself for a bit. But I think there's so many really great resources out there about like, what does it mean to be an activist? How do you become an activist? How do you like, how do you become an agent of change in your community? And for me right now, my practice of activism is paying attention to what everyone else is already doing and putting my work there. Yeah.
I love that. Oh, and I'm outside and you still suck the air out of the room twice. When you talk about the liturgy, we're assuming they can read. I was like, oh my goodness, my heart broke with that.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of what we do is just meeting needs, but it breaks my heart. I live in a very generous area where we have about 100 homeless students here. They don't have a definite number. Over at Virginia Tech, not 20 minutes away, we have over 1,000 students. We have a homeless community of women that have jobs, but there's not enough to sustain them at our Walmart parking lot. And we can get resources to help meet needs, but it's the systemic issues that's causing this. That's breaking my heart. And what I've learned is, and I'm the opposite. I don't feel like I know anything. It's crazy. It's just, it seems like I'm always in the right place at the right time, or I'm gifted at making the right relationships. I have some amazing partners, and a lot of my partners are not faith-based, but wonderful spiritual people, wonderful people. And we are seeing a lot of change, but I found out personally, for me, it's a whole lot easier to find someone who's doing it and doing it right. And instead of me trying to, for me personally, instead of me trying to recreate the wheel.
Yep.
Man, that was awesome. And just broke my heart. Having talk about Minneapolis. I want to read my second favorite quote from your book. Then I got to read my favorite quote before the end. This is my second favorite quote. And you said, this was a scrabbly God, gleaning what was dropped, picking the losing side every time. This was a brown God, dressing in skin rich and dark. This was a God who worked not with a commanding voice, but in a whisper that was best heard in sheer silence. A God who was joyfully stuck with whoever was willing to say yes. I love that. And that's what reminds me of what you just said about finding someone who, who's already doing it, and really, I mean, I'm at a loss of words for a lot of what you said. It was really great. Thank you.
No problem.
This has been so wonderful. And I could keep talking forever, but I want to respect your time. I was going through the book a second time, and if you wouldn't mind maybe touching on maybe just a different understanding of theology from where I'm at. A lot of people will know the story differently than the way you'd covered it in the book. But I was rereading the book a second time when AOC, who I'll be honest, I'm a huge fan of, got so disrespected at our Capitol. At the time when that happened, I was reading through the book and was going through Jesus talking about turning the other cheek. And it was, I won't say I fact checked you, but I did go back and look at scripture. It was awesome. it was one of those humbling moments of just like when you go to seminary, you learn all this stuff, and then you wonder, what did I really learn? And I've really felt more and more. I've learned more over relationships and talks and studies. And you hit me hard when you said, quit reading a book and get out there and do something. Because, I mean, I read a ludicrous amount of books. I mean, that's what I'm going to say. I have ADHD. I don't sleep. I work nights. During our progressive path my wife and I've been on, I've been able to quit my job of 26 years last year. I've always been bivocational ministry. And so I work nights part-time with a job that allows me to listen to audiobooks or read on Kindle sometimes while I'm working. And I mean, I'm talking about, it'd be embarrassing the number of books I get to read. And so when you said that, I was like, oh gosh, that's a punch to the gut.
Well, yes, and I meant that just for you. No,
no, my wife's gonna love this.
well, and I think what happens, and what specifically that critique is about, is that when we feel like we need to react to an immediate problem, an urgent problem, we're like, okay, I need to get informed on this. And then what happens is the news cycle turns over, we've finished the book group, and we're like, okay, well, it's not in the news anymore, and we finished the book, so like, the energy kind of dissipates, right? Like, that's just a natural, like,
yeah.
And so when people are like, okay, what do I need to do? I'm like, get out of the house. Like, we can do the book group later if you're still interested, but like, you need to like go and find something you can do. And I remember doing that a lot because people were asking in Minneapolis, like, what do I do? What can I do? And everybody was recommending, you know, that was the week that the New York Times bestseller list was full of like every book on anti-racism. It was beautiful and important, and it should be like that. And what I kept posting on Facebook was not like, you know, go buy this book, but here, read this article, which is short and summarizes the basic concepts of this book. And then here is a Costco that I know for a fact will let you buy as many diaper packs as you want. You know, go there and then buy them and then drive them over here and drop them off. And no, you will not get a tax exempt, you know, a tax certificate. Save your receipt and write it off yourself. And I think, you know, what happens is what we're trying to do in activism is capitalize on where is the energy, and the energy is always highest right after a major crisis. And so how do we chase it down and direct it in the right way? And if we direct it into book groups, then it's dangerous, because sometimes the energy can just die there and we don't get the work done that could get done. It's not that book groups or reading are bad. But yeah, that like, especially as a group, like, where are we going to set the energy? But yeah, that turning the other cheek, man, I don't think I have a copy. I think it's at my office. One of the biggest problems of the pandemic is that all of my books are at my office. And so like, I'll think of something and be like, well, I guess the one day that I go in this week, I'll make sure to cite that. But there was a great book called, I think I mentioned it at the back of One Coin Found. Don't Forgive Too Soon was the book that introduced me to that reinterpretation of, I'm trying to remember what chapter I talked about it in. Hermeneutics of Suspicion? No, that's not the one. Whatever. But yeah, it's this book called Don't Forgive Too Soon, and it talked about an interpretation that had been put forward by Walter Wink in his book, I think, The Powers That Be, or maybe The Third Way. And what he's talking about is this interpretation. Do you want me to explain it for people who haven't read it? Is that what you were leading me towards? Okay.
Yeah.
So, and I get to every year.
And I think it was Third Way, because I think I read that book based off the reference you did, because, you know, I read a lot of books.
Exactly.
And I only say that to say is, I really think sometimes it's easy for the faith community to feel like, well, I've done my part. I've educated myself.
Exactly.
But you're not doing anything with what you've learned. But I'm sorry. I'm just having fun, Emmy. Go ahead.
You're fine. Take your time. I was still trying to find the reference. Whatever. It's in there somewhere. So this comes up, turn the other cheek, or turn, someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the left cheek, also comes up in both Matthew and Luke's Gospels, which means 2 out of 3 years at some point I get to preach on them. Usually it's around February, because it's an early teaching of Jesus. And I love bringing a kid up for this. And we have a photo of one of our church kids at age 4, just like socking me right in the face for this. He thought it was the greatest thing he'd ever done. It was a lot of fun. And I dramatically like threw myself backwards to get out of the way of his punch. But then because I threw myself backwards so hard, people thought he'd actually hit me. It was hilarious. I thought it was hilarious. Everybody else was like, that child just punched a pastor. We are in big trouble. But essentially what I have him do is come up and say like, okay, which is the right side of your body? Okay, so this is my right side. I know I'm mirrored right now, but so this is my right side. The other person's right side is their opposite side, right? Okay. So if you're going to hit somebody on their right cheek, how do you hit them? And sometimes what I'll just start with is like, if you're going to hit somebody, how do you hit them? And I'll make a fist and punch. And the interesting thing is that if you have a right-handed person punching, that's going to be a hit on the other person's left cheek, right? Because that's just like, that's the best mechanics. You're going to slug somebody sideways that way. Give them a good right hook. But you notice the text says if somebody hits you on the right cheek. So then we have to experiment with like, how do you get, a punch that would normally land here? How do you get to hit here if you're using a hand that you can't punch like that? You have to backhand. And so there's a lot of, there's archaeological evidence coming forward now, essentially archaeological, sociological evidence coming forward now that the right hand, which, okay, so everybody's assumed to be right-handed in this society. If you use the right hand and you're backhanding someone, this is a gesture you would use that is from a superior to an inferior. It would be from a husband to a wife, a parent to a child, a master to a servant or a slave, like a Roman centurion to somebody who's not a centurion. Like because it's also a gesture that can go downwards, like you are beneath me, remember your place. And so the interpretation that Walter Wink puts forward, and that I also then repeat in the book, and that I repeat every year when I get to preach on this, is to turn your right cheek would require the person when someone hits you on the right cheek, right? So somebody backhands you. When someone hits you on the right cheek, turn the left one also. Because the left one requires a punch or an open-handed slap. And Walter Wink's argument is those were wrestling moves used between equals. And so the form of turn the other cheek is not submit and receive whatever blows the other person is giving you, but rather do not fight back and perpetuate the cycle of violence, but in turning the left cheek, insist that when they hit you, they have to recognize you as an equal, which reestablishes the true hierarchy of God, which is that all are beloved children of God. Like, I'm not going to fight back, but I'm also going to remind you that you are not actually greater than me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've seen that reflected, that third way thinking, reflected how AOC handled the way she was handled, what she was talked down to. What we're seeing in debates right now, which I thought was beautiful. And even go back to the civil rights movement with MLK Jr. It was just, it was one of those things when I read it, and it was just like, again, it just opened up such a beautiful this. I can't recommend the book enough to people.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things that just completely blew my mind, and then just made so much sense when I realized in seminary that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor. Like, I feel like that just, like, I think most of the time when we do, like, we talk about his civil rights work, but we don't in secular schools, in public schools, talk about him as a pastor, which, like, okay, there's some, interesting tension about religiosity there, which I'm fine with. But, like, why did no one ever talk about that in church? Why did we never have a Martin Luther King Day in church and talk about, like, this man did all this incredible work in large part because he was so grounded in his faith? Right? Because he was so grounded in this idea that, like, we are all beloved children of God. We have rights. We have the power to, like, nonviolently resist. So I think you're absolutely right. Like, figuring out how do we respond to acts of violence, whether they're verbal or physical, with a reflection, like, basically with a mirror of, like, I'm going to force you to face up to your actions, which is absolutely, I think you're right, what AOC has done, especially did in that time when she was, verbally assaulted, and then came forward and said, like, this is exactly what was said to me, and this is why I'm not going to be silent about it. I think we see it in the civil rights movement. I think we see it in lots of different acts of nonviolent resistance, where it's not just about, take whatever's coming to you. But if you look at the trajectory of the civil rights movement, it was about, like, how do we systematically and carefully and logically plan out moments where we will know photographers will be on site, where we know that police will react with absolutely, like, absurd amounts of violence, and it will end up on the cover of the New York Times, and people will see, like, oh my God, they are using fire hoses against human bodies. This is atrocious. We have to act. And so that's about, like, you're submitting to the violence that's happening, but you're not allowing that violence to continue because you're drawing a worldwide eye to it. I think that's, the best of the protests that we've had here in Minneapolis are doing the same thing of, like, yeah, we look like a really nice progressive city, and Minnesota Nice is the name of the game, but like we're actually not doing that great. We still have redlining active and happening. We have I just saw a map recently of like one of the internet, like the cheap internet provider from Minneapolis just doesn't cover the communities that are primarily communities of color. Like we're providing cheap internet to the parts of Minneapolis that are predominantly white. What? Like, so we still have these problems, and we don't, unless we can find ways to call attention to them, it is so hard to fight them on the ground. So I suppose that's another part of activism, is like, not only do we pay attention to what's already happening, but how do we help amplify it for people who might not notice or might not understand what's going on? I guess that was the end of my rant.
Like, I could listen all night. I want to share my favorite quote. I'm sure this is not, I'm not the only one, this is my favorite quote. Is, you know, I really only love God as much as I love the person I love the least. And that has been so convicting to me personally, as over the years I've been able to tear down structures of resistance to other people, groups, other people, but there's still a large group of people out there that you may hear blow by with their tailpipes, and just I'm struggling with that.
Yep.
Struggle with that. But everything you've said today comes back to that. We only love God as much as we love the one we love the least. And I think the book is profound. I think the book is beautiful. In the just a few minutes we have left, I want to check with you, if it's okay, personally, to see how are you and your wife doing in the world of COVID, everything going on.
We're good. I will just add quickly that quote is not original to me. That's a Dorothy Day quote. And so everyone should attribute that correctly. I actually have that on a card, like right at hand, just coincidentally, we're featuring it. I sent home different like quotes that were from Christian thinkers for people to reflect on that would tie along with the gospel, because right now we're still doing at-home worship entirely. How are we doing? You know what? We just passed our 2nd anniversary. We've been married for 2 years.
What a second year.
Like, have we been married for 2 years, or have we been married for 12 now? Like, what does 2020 count as? Or have we been married for only 1 year and 2020 is just a wash? But so we had to get creative. Normally we like to travel for our, anniversary. We like to go stay somewhere nearby during the, at least for one overnight. And we had to get creative with how we wanted to do that. And so what we ended up doing is there's a new company in Minneapolis called Pitched, and they have these really fancy, like, wedding style canvas tents that you can sleep in, and they will come and set it up in your backyard for you for a fee. And then they do the whole setup. It's so brilliant. And it's so beautifully decorated. Like, they have this cool mattress and like these interior lights, all these really nice pillows. They can set up this outdoor picnic table. It's just so lovely. And like, somebody else comes and sets up the whole tent and then leaves. And I was like, this is great. This is exactly how I want to camp. I want to camp. So I want somebody else to set up the tent, and I want to be 10 steps from my bathroom. Like, I like, if the cooking over the grill does not work out, I want to be able to go inside and just fire something up on the stove. We did have great steaks over an open fire, but so we're doing okay, because we're trying to be intentional about taking care of ourselves and taking care of each other, and sort of checking in about like, where are we at? How are we doing? One of my friend Natalia, who I'm on a podcast on, she and her husband have a yearly State of the Union, where they take a couple hours on or around their anniversary and go for a walk and talk about like, how are we doing? Like, where are we at? What do we need? My wife and I had a really good conversation where my wife was like, I don't feel like we like talk like the way we did when we were first getting to know each other. And I'm like, yeah, I feel like all my funny stories. So like, what do I have to bring to the table now? Like, I only have the boring stuff. But so we started looking like, okay, let's find, like those really cheesy, like, questions to ask your spouse. And a couple of them were like, really, like, one was, what can I do to be, making this relationship more fulfilling for you in your career trajectory? I was like, that's a stupid question. What I want to know is like, okay, tell me a story about 3rd grade, like, just tell me a story. And so we're trying to practice those grounding techniques of not staying too focused on the big picture. Like, we have tons of big picture stuff going on about like growing our family and our own career trajectories and where we're working and where we're living and whether, you know, like this is not going to be our forever house. So like, when are we going to move and where? And we also want to really preserve that sense of like, we are just two individuals who are making a life together. And some of that is just telling silly and pointless stories together and spending time in each other's presence. So when we keep that focused, that definitely grounds both of us and improves our mental, physical, spiritual health and the health of our relationship. So, you know, I keep saying after coffee hour on Sundays, like what we're shooting for is okay. Like that is what we are all, if like, I am not expecting anyone in the world right now to be great. In fact, if you are feeling great, I am suspicious. So like I'm shooting for okay. And I feel like we're okay.
I'm glad. I just asked because people that watch, I know everyone's wondering about themselves. So I'm always talking to everybody I talk to, ask how they're doing. And just nothing else, people can listen and get some ideas or some suggestions. My wife is amazing. She took a deck of cards and we played this matching game with questions on it. That it was I'm a crier, Emmy. If we talk long enough, I'd sob. I'm a crier, and I cry every time I talk about my wife because she's just come into my life at such a time when I really, really, God knew what I needed. And but that game right there was so sweet. And recently somebody else gave us a question that was it was a hard one to answer too. It's like because after you're together, we've been together, 5-6 years now, and so what the question is tell me something boring about yourself. Yeah, and it was like, and not that narcissistic, like everything about me. And it was such a neat question, and that was one of her matching questions too. And the things that she found boring about herself was some of the things that I find just so uniquely beautiful about her. That's just so quirky. And she'll watch this too, and she'll mind me saying, but she collects office supplies like nobody's business. I mean, she has a cracked addict's addiction to markers on Amazon. And I'm colorblind, so I see like 5 colors. And she has, I'm not lying, she has like bins and bins of this.
Why'd you buy 5 red markers?
Yeah. Oh no, I found like 20 red markers. Because she loves the color, and she colors on different mediums for different things. It's very therapeutic. She's the head of Child Protective Services for one of our local counties, DSS. So she's awesome woman, awesome job. But so I too always I worry about other couples. I worry about people in general. I worry about my students. I worry about the people I interact with in the community, and we're also are trying to take care of each other during all of this, because there were some things that we noticed that was starting to kind of lapse too. You almost fall into survival mode on some things, but we love camping. I know we love camping. So, and we haven't got to do it. We have a son who's type 1 diabetic, and we have a 6-month-old and a 2-year-old, and I have 4 grown children from a previous marriage, but that aren't with us. But so we haven't been able to do all the camping things that we do. So you're saying like camp in the backyard. I'm like, why didn't I think of that? That's awesome.
Yeah. And we've done that. Like we have a tent. So we've gone camping this summer at a couple campgrounds. The last one that we camped at, there was a giant thunderstorm. Michelle hates thunderstorms. So after that, it was like, no, never again. I'm sure we will go again. But yeah, we set up our ordinary tent in the backyard, I think in June, like when the weather got nice, and we were like, okay, now it feels like we're on a vacation, but we also don't have to sleep here. We can go sleep in our nice bed.
That's awesome.
So it was great.
Amy, I want to thank you so much. What is next? Is there any new projects or anything you have going on? Or anything you want to share, or we're on social media?
Yeah, so people can find me on social media on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at EMMYKEGLER, my first and last name, Emmy Kegler. Feel free to reach out, some questions if you have them. Do I have any projects going on? I mean, I have a second book due to my publisher soon. God bless them. They've already given me one extension. They're like, okay, you can't, like, you need to tell us if you need another. So I'm working on it. And that is All Who Are Weary, Easing the Burden on the Walk with Mental Illness. So that's been a heavy writing process for the past 6 months, obviously during COVID, but it's starting to take shape of an actual book that I think will be helpful. It's intended for both people who live with mental illness and then also people who help care for them. So families, friends, pastors, church communities, even therapists, to help work through what do we think about the interaction between religion and spirituality and our mental health and illness and wellness, and how do we, create stronger connections that can help facilitate that in a more healthy way for everyone involved. So that's the primary thing I'm working on right now. Of course, I still have One Coin Found available. I always have new entries up and new content up at the Queer Grace Encyclopedia, which is queergrace.com, where I work through, I and a group of other writers work through a lot of the main questions around LGBTQ inclusion in the Christian church. So if you have interest in a lot of free and continually updated content, you can find it at queergrace.com.
And thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I appreciate your time. My birthday's this Saturday, and this has been my birthday present. So thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, I hope you're getting an actual birthday present.
No.